Theories have three common characteristics. They claim that we progress through stages in order because the things that you learn in one stage are going to help you learn the thing for the next stage, right? So they build upon each other. You progress through the stages in age groups, right? So it's based on age. Until you reach a certain age, you can't move on to the next level, much like how in a video game, until you beat a certain boss, you can't move on to the next level. And they focus on what they call these major discontinuities in development, right? That each stage is going to bring a dramatic change in behavior. So rather than having a smooth transition between stages, there's a big lesson that you learn that affects your behavior in each stage. So the first stage we're going to look at, or stage theory, is Erikson's stage, right? So his stage theory is different from the other stage theories in that it covers the life from birth until death, rather than focusing only on childhood like much of the other stage theories. So in his stage theories, Erikson focuses on what he calls the psychosocial crises. Okay, so this is where a person is dealing with a situation that's going to determine how they develop their personality. Okay, so there's one crisis per stage. 444, you have all the different stages in Erikson's theory, and they all have the different crises. So in the first stage, trust versus mistrust, right? The infant is learning whether or not they're being cared for or not. In autonomy versus shame and doubt, they figure out whether or not they're able to do things on their own. In initiative versus guilt, right? They learn whether or not they are good or bad. Can they choose to be good? In industry versus inferiority, this is focusing more on their academic achievement and social development, right? Are they able to make friends with others? Identity versus confusion, this is where they are figuring out kind of who they are, what makes them unique. Intimacy versus isolation focuses on the development of close, deep relationships. Generativity versus self-absorption is finding fulfillment either in their work and family or not. And then in integrity versus despair, the last stage, this is kind of where they do a life review and they think whether or not they regret any of their choices. Do they believe they had a good life or not? Focuses on your cognitive development, right? How it is that we learn and develop our cognitive abilities. So the main way that we learn is through assimilation and accommodation by interacting with our environment, right? So Piaget believed that our exposure to different environments and stimulation is what allows us to learn, okay? So we can assimilate information if it fits within our schemas, right? Our existing categories inside of our brain, right? If it fits in a category, we can easily integrate it. If it does not fit into an existing category, we then have to accommodate, create a new category, and reorganize the information. So he has 4 stages in his stage theory. The first 2 are sensory motor and pre-operational. In the sensory motor stage, you are looking at an infant till about 2 years old. So they are learning using their senses with their environment. And the thing that you learn in this stage is object permanence. So you learn that things can exist outside of your visual perception. So even if you cannot see it, it continues to exist. In the pre-operational stage, you can start thinking in some symbolic thought, okay? Now, in this stage, you are going through centration, right? You're only able to focus on one issue, right? One part of a problem, okay? So in the video that we watched, right, this was where the little girl, when they were sharing cookies, she said that because she had 1 cookie and the lady had 2 cookies, they didn't share fairly. But when the lady broke her 1 cookie in half, she then said it was fair because they both had 2, right? So she was focusing on the amount and not exactly the quantity, right? The number versus quantity, okay? They also go through egocentrism, right? They can't understand that the world looks different from other people's perspectives. They assume that whatever they can see, everyone else can see it as well. And this also leads to animism, right? So the belief that everything is alive because I'm alive. So this is why young children will often believe that their toys are also living beings. Stage, we can perform more symbolic observations, right? They go through decentration, so now they realize that quantity and quality are 2 different things, right? So if you break my cookie in half, I still only have 1 cookie. right? They're able to do reversibility, right? So this would be the water cup problem. They realize that you can pour the water back into the original cup and it's still the same amount. And conservation, right? So for example, with the quarters, right? When you spread out the quarters, the little girl thought that the row that had the spread out quarters had more, even though both rows had 5. All right, so just because something looks different doesn't mean that it's changed, okay? And in the last stage, the formal operational stage, this is where you begin to develop abstract thought and you can think logically and theoretically. They go through all the different types of conservation and at what age you can learn that conservation, right? So the first one is conservation of number. So remember the girl with the quarters, conservation of mass. If you flatten out a clay ball, they'll say that the flat one has more until they get to about ages 7 and 8. Conservation of length. If you move things around, they're going to think that one is longer than the other. And conservation of area. If you break something up, they assume that it takes up more space. Of the zone of proximal development in order to explain how it is that we learn new things. So he published his ideas in his book Thought and Language, and he emphasized that we learn through social interactions with parents, teachers, and more advanced peers, right? That we learn by getting their guidance and help, okay? So the zone of proximal development is, if you look at this little circle picture, right? The first level in the center is everything that you already know and understand. The second level, that second ring, is all the things that you can learn with a little bit of help. The third zone is all the things that you cannot understand yet, even with help, right? So if you try to learn something in zone 3, you're going to have frustration, right? Versus in zone 2, if you get help trying to learn the zone 2 things, you can learn them. Stages of developing your moral reasoning, right? Your understanding of right from wrong. So he focused on our reasoning, right? Our logic behind why things are right and wrong, not necessarily focusing on how we actually behave, because there are people who know right from wrong and continue to do wrong things anyway. Okay? So he measured these levels of moral development using what he called moral dilemmas, right? So depending on how someone responds to a moral dilemma, right? A situation that doesn't necessarily have a correct answer, right? But depending how they answer that situation is which level they'll fall into, right? So there's 3 main levels, and then each one has 2 sub-levels, which you'll see in the next slide. So the pre-conventional level, in general, you learn that good and bad is avoiding punishment and getting rewarded, right? Certain behaviors are going to get you in trouble. Certain behaviors are going to get you reward. So you are going to behave in a way that avoids punishment and gets rewarded. The conventional stage is where you learn that rules are necessary for maintaining social order, right? Without rules, we would have anarchy. Therefore, we should follow all the rules to keep society running smoothly. In the post-conventional stage, this is where you develop your own thoughts on morals and ethics, and you believe that rules can be wrong. So if a rule goes against your own morals and ethics, then you are going to ignore that rule or see it as invalid. The Kohlberg stage is broken down. So within the pre-conventional level, again, you start out avoiding punishment, and then in stage 2 is when you start doing things to get rewards. In the conventional level, you first start out by learning what's good and bad based on the approval of other people. Then you move on to the authority orientation, where you see the rules as important for keeping order. Stage 5, in the post-conventional level, this is where you realize that rules can be wrong. And then in stage 6 is when you decide that your own morals and ethics are more important. Levels through a longitudinal study where he followed a group of boys and presented them with 60 moral dilemmas. And as they got older, he would present them with the dilemmas again to see how their responses would change, right? So they tracked that the pre-conventional stage was very high in the young ages when you're about 7, right? It tends to decline as they mature. The conventional stage tends to increase in middle childhood, right around middle school. And then the post-conventional stage comes about in adolescence, right? And as the children transition through these stages, right, at the points that they cross, they see that they kind of go in between the stages at these mixing points.